Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this track in this conference. My name is Vaughan Waller. I'm your track chair for this track in the auditorium today. And the subject, as you've probably read 100 times already, is open learning. Now, that term reminds me of one of my first jobs in learning technologies. And that was when I gave technical support to companies who ran things called open learning centers. That was when a company had a number of PCs set up in a room somewhere, and staff came in and did a generic training program there and then disappeared again. But then networks came along, and of course, therefore, the need for the room has disappeared, and largely so did my job. So open learning then tended to sort of fall away as a term. It didn't really sort of figure much. Everything was sort of online and networked and what have you. And I thought, well, open learning, no, that was then. But it's back in a completely different form, and one that is, I think, bears very little resemblance to what I did all those years ago. And today, to speak to us about the new open learning, if we can call it that, is someone who's very, very experienced in that field. And he is a senior lecturer in Education and Information Technology at the Plymouth Institute of Education. So please put your hands together and welcome Steve Wheeler.
Oh, thank you very much. Good afternoon. Oh, almost good afternoon. Good morning. Nice to see you all. It's always a joy to be here on this stage, actually. I know this stage. This stage and me are like that. You know, we're old friends. I've tripped over just about every part of the carpet here at some point. But anyway, it's nice to be here. This title really, I suppose, should be called openness rather than just open learning, because, you know, as Vaughan says, open learning has been around a long time. It is kind of reformatting itself in many ways, and we are looking at open learning in a different light now with the advent of new technologies. But openness is actually a much more overarching theme, I think. So if you don't mind, I'm going to change this to openness, all right? And then we'll look at how various aspects of learning are becoming more open, or you know, possibly not, because of certain people, you know, misinterpreting it and seeing it maybe as a threat. I don't know what your views are on openness. Are you open? Are you somebody who is in a training room and you leave the door open, for instance? Maybe not just physically, but also metaphorically. What do you do when you're in the classroom? Why do teachers, why do trainers, why do learning and development professionals shut the door when they're in a room with a group of trainees or learners? That's an interesting question. And I heard a story from Sir Ken Robinson. You've probably heard this story as well, but I'm going to tell it to you again anyway if you haven't. He talks about a little girl who was in a classroom, and the teacher walks over to her and says, let's call her Sophie. Sophie, what are you doing there? And Sophie says, I'm drawing a picture. And so the teacher says, what are you drawing a picture of? She says, I'm drawing a picture of God. And the teacher says, but nobody knows what God looks like. And Sophie says, well, they will when I've finished. You know, it's one of these kind of things that children do. They imagine. And Gerd Leonard, earlier on, you heard him talking about imagination and about intuition and about all the human elements that are really important to us too, that make us human. And I was coming back on the train. I was in Norway last week, in Oslo, and I was coming back on the train on Father's Day. And there was a woman 2 seats down from me, and she had her little daughter with her. It's a bit like Sophie's story. She had a little daughter with her, and she was helping her to fill out her Father's Day card, because they were obviously going to see her father. And so she was saying to her, look, I've drawn the heart for you. Now you have to fill it in. And the little girl said, okay. And she said, no, you need to fill it in red. It needs to be red. And the little girl said, why? She said, because that's what a heart is. A heart is red in colour. And the little girl said, well, I want to fill it in blue. They had a bit of an argument about it, and in the end the girl won, and she started filling it in blue. And then the woman was saying to her, look, darling, you must fill it in, you mustn't go over the lines. Why not, she said, you know. And it must have looked something like this, I suppose, really. You know, the idea that we kind of adopt our ideas from our early childhood, and we're told not to colour outside the lines. We're told not to do things differently. We're told to do things according to the rules. And of course, openness is a bit like that, because I suppose if and when you trained as a learning development professional or a teacher or an instructor or whatever, you probably were given rules to follow. So my notion of being a teacher was always to stand at the front and always to talk at my students. And of course, later on when I trained in a more professional context, I learned that actually it's not about teaching, it's about learning. And it's actually about sometimes breaking the rules or bending them to actually suit the needs of the learners that are in your classroom or in your context. And often even the idea of classroom now is becoming much more anachronistic, because often now we're teaching beyond the walls of the classroom, and that's another form of openness that we can discuss. So let's go through this and let's try to have a conversation at the end of this. This is very much my own personal view on this. There are some areas of research which I'm going to talk to you about, which are empirical and which, kind of set the standard for what we know about learning and about how people learn. But essentially in this talk, really what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a personal perspective, and that personal perspective may not jive with everything that you believe, and maybe it will, I don't know. But let's have a discussion and a conversation about this, and let's see where we end up with this kind of exploration of openness. So, I'll start with a quote. Peter Drucker, you've heard of. I'll let you read it. So we are in an area of, a time of change, great change. We're in a time of exponential change. It's not linear anymore. And we really don't know what's coming around the corner next. I mean, Gerd and people like Ray Kurzweil and so on, people like Michio Kaku, these people, are in the business of trying to predict the future, or at least trying to describe the trends. But to be honest, none of us really knows what's going to happen next. The future is imaginary. The past is a memory. It's only the present that we've got right now. So it's difficult to predict the future, and it's difficult to predict what change it's going to bring. We can see the trends, but really it's quite a difficult proposition. So it's all about turbulence. But we cannot afford to try to solve problems now with yesterday's logic. And this is why, I will show you hopefully in a moment, why I think openness is an important way forward for us to consider. I've shown this slide before sometimes. Can you see what it is? Shout it out if you know what this is. It's Obama. It's not his inauguration. I thought it was, but they're all in shirt sleeves, and I think the inauguration is usually in the wintertime, isn't it, in Washington. This is actually in Germany, in the summer, in Berlin. He's at the Brandenburg Gate, and he's addressing hundreds of thousands of people all the way down this Brandenburg Gate area. And his history is about to be made. He's about to become the first black president of the United States. And there are people in the background, or in the foreground here. Can you see what they're doing? They're all taking pictures, exactly. If you look closer up, you see what's happening. They've all got both hands in the air. There's even a guy here with a laptop. He's live streaming. Yeah, they're really interested in getting the pictures and getting the experience and trying to capture that moment. And what's happening here is not only are they capturing the moment, what they're also doing is they're connecting a lot of them with people that they care about who can't be there. And what they're doing is they're sharing that moment with people. And that's exactly the kind of openness that we're seeing now in lots of learning contexts around the world. We're seeing connected audiences, connected learners, and we're seeing society changing because of that connectivity. And what we're seeing is people creating content, mixing, repurposing content, sharing it, organizing it. And that is a new form of openness that we're seeing happening around the world in lots of different formal and informal learning contexts. So consider that, the idea of ubiquitous connectivity. Everyone's got a mobile phone these days. It doesn't matter where you go, even in the poorest nations of the world. I was in the Gambia about a year and a half ago with several of my students. And even there, you've got kids on the street, poorest nation in Africa, and yet they've got mobile phones in their hands. It might not be smartphones, but they're phones that are connecting nevertheless. And they know how to find information using them. So we've got this society now that's moving forwards and it's changing. And there's a picture of my learners taking notes. That's what they do now. They don't tend to, my younger learners, they don't tend to write down notes anymore. Some of them do, but a lot of them now take pictures of things. A lot of you have been taking pictures today, haven't you? And for me, that's a kind of a sign of the change. And I just want to show you this. You know what the selfie is? Have you heard of the selfie? So you take a picture of yourself and put it up on Facebook or something. Everyone's doing selfies these days. Everyone's kind of projecting their identity in this kind of new open economy that we've got. And I just thought I'd show you that. I mean, there's several messages that you can get out of this. I mean, one of them could be that don't believe everything you read on the internet. So we do need this kind of new understanding of the content that we see that is open and available online. So don't believe everything you see. Be critical about it. Think about what it means. Think about where it comes from. Think about who's created it and what's it saying to you. And Photoshop, you see, covers a majority of sins. You know, it's a very easy thing to use these days, so you can create all sorts of content which is erroneous or misleading. But the idea of people taking pictures of themselves and putting it up onto the web might sound crass, you know, banal and, you know, silly, frivolous, but a lot of people do this because they want to show people who they are. It's about their identity. It's about them being open about who they are. So things are changing. And open thinking. If anyone here has a piece of paper and a pen, some of you might still be in that mode, I don't know, have a go at this. Can you actually draw 9 dots and then try to join them up with just 4 straight lines without taking your pencil off? It's got to be kind of like a continuous, you know, kind of way of doing it. Okay, so can you draw 4 straight lines and join all 9 dots together with those 4 straight lines? Anyone want to have a go at that? Does anyone know the answer to this? You know the answer to it. Ben knows. Ben's a genius. He's in the front. That's why he's in the front row. You know. Who else knows the answer to this? Right. So several of you have seen this before, no doubt, and you know where we're going with this. Shall I show you the answer to actually save you from, you know, kind of making your head explode? The answer is that. And the thing is, you see, most people see a box there. But in fact, it's not a box at all. It's just 9 dots in that kind of configuration. And the reason that most people can't actually do the task the first time round successfully is because they're working inside the box. And the whole idea of thinking outside the box is that you're thinking in an open and different way. You're thinking beyond your own constraints. In other words, you constrain yourselves and you have to think beyond that. You have to think more openly. And there's this idea of fixity which comes about where we tend to constrain ourselves through our thinking because we've always done it that way. Oh, I can't do that. That's against the rules. Well, who says? Think about the rules again. What do they actually allow you to do? And are you able to bend them or break them in some way to get where you need to be? So we need to pull ourselves out of fixity. So that's the kind of the open thinking model, if you like, or thought process. Can we actually get ourselves out of the constraints we put ourselves into? And then there's the idea of creative connections. Can we make creative connections? Are we still creative when we leave school? Or does school knock it out of us? I think it was Csikszentmihalyi the other day talking about the idea of divergent thinking. When a child is in school for the first time, they're great divergent thinkers. They can think of many, many different things that an object can be. So, for instance, a paperclip. They can probably think of hundreds of different uses for a paperclip because they're not constrained. They're not fixed into the idea of seeing it as a metal object about that big. They see different versions of it. They see it maybe 150 foot tall and being made out of foam rubber. Their imagination is incredible. By the time they're 12 years old, they can only think of about a dozen purposes for it. And by the time we leave school, it's a paperclip. That's all it is. So the idea of making creative connections, we have to pull ourselves out of that if we're going to be open thinkers, I think, as well. And so, you know, what you want to be when you grow up is the question. Hopefully still a creative thinker, still somebody who thinks openly. So what does it mean to be open in learning? What does it mean to be somebody who practices open scholarship or open practice? Well, I'm going to explore that with you for, briefly now, looking at some of the things that we can do to be more open as learning professionals. Charles Ledbetter says, you are what you share. So there's a sharing culture that we need to be involved in. We need to move beyond the kind of the conceptions that we've had that were probably inculcated into us in school, where if it's yours, and you don't share it. You don't give it away. And then people like Winston Churchill say a very similar thing. It's what we give as well as what we earn that's important to us. And even Mark Zuckerberg has talked about the gift economy. So a lot of people are talking about this, and these people aren't stupid. They've obviously thought through what they're talking about here, about mutual giving and so on. So another thing that we need to consider is breaking down the silos. If you go into a school, subjects are taught. You're not teaching learners, you're teaching subjects. So today we're doing science, and it might be biology science, it might be very specific, and then next period we're going to do maths, and then we're going to finish off with some English and then a foreign language like French. And yet, if we think about it logically, if we think about it openly, every subject relates to every other subject, doesn't it? So why don't we teach maths with music, for instance, or physics with chemistry? Why don't we teach English language with history? Why don't we actually break down the silos? Let's be more open about this. So I went into a school, I think it was, I'll name them and give them a big up, because Skipton Girls' School up in Skipton, in Yorkshire. Long way to get to from where I live, but I went there for the day, and I actually met some of their students, and I gave a speech and sat and talked with the teachers and so on. And then the young people who were in some of the groups came and actually showed us what they were doing. And it's an engineering college for girls. Now that sounds to me like, it should be, and yet it's very rare that should happen. It's an engineering college for just for girls. And one of the things they showed me was their work around physics and music. And they were using synthesizers and finding out how they were made and so on, and finding out how they worked. And then they were looking at waveforms, and they were looking at the science behind the physics, and then applying it to music. And another group, I think, were doing something with languages and a science. And what they've done is they've broken down the silos. They've become more open in the way they teach in that school. And I asked one of the little girls, she was probably no more than about, 12 or 13 years old. I said to her, what is it about learning subjects together that is so important? And she just simply said to me, in front of all the teachers, she said, it makes it easier to understand the world. Now that's quite profound if you think about it. It makes it easier to understand the world. Isn't that what we're trying to do with education, with learning? Isn't it what we're trying to reach? Isn't it the end point where we're trying to make things easier to understand so that we can learn them better and then apply them in real contexts and situations? So, breaking down silos. And I'm just wondering if this is what your learning area looks like in your organization. Is anyone familiar with that at all? Is that what it looks like? Or does it look more like this? Or does it look more like this, maybe? Because increasingly, I'm telling you this now, and you know it, we're going towards that. We're going towards the informal, on-the-move learning. And there's a place for centralized learning in an organization, but there's also a place for the informal aspects as well. I've got good news for you. I don't think that learning professionals will ever be out of a job. I think we'll always need learning professionals, but I think the roles are changing. And what we're doing now is different to what we used to do maybe 10, 12, 14, 15 years ago. The roles are changing, but I think we'll always have teachers and learning and development professionals. I think we'll always need them because there are so many things that we do which cannot be done any other way. So come back to me on that later on and we'll discuss that. That's 5 generations of mobile device, by the way, there. And this is the first on the left-hand side there. Yeah. On the right-hand side there. So Derek Bruff, who's an American academic, I met him recently when we were sharing a spot in Qatar. He said, one of the most important technical, active, open, flexible learning technologies is this. I just want you to think for a minute, what would it be? What is one of the most important technologies for active, flexible, open learning? Any ideas? What do you think? A book, possibly? Yeah. Anyone over this side? Human mind. Oh, right, okay. You're starting to cook with gas now. Anyone else? He's talking about inside the classroom now, by the way. So let me show you. This is what he said. What do you think about that? It means that obviously people can move around. It means that you can collaborate. It means you can talk to each other. It means you don't have to stay in one place anymore. It means that maybe you don't have to sit in rows or around circles. You can move around and remain sat down if you need to, but actually be more flexible in where you're learning. And many, many years ago, back in 2001 it was actually, when I heard of a school near to where I lived and worked, which had just provided a new desktop computer for each of its year 6 children. It's primary school, and they were all 10, 11 years old. And there were 36 children in the class, and they gave a desktop to each one of them, and it was theirs and theirs alone for the whole of that year in their year 6. And that was fabulously new and different at the time. It was quite exciting. And a lot of people were really kind of thrilled about this. Wow, this is the future. Give each child a personal computer, which is theirs alone. So we went in and we got permission to go in with a research assistant, and we sat her in there for 3 days a week, and she observed what happened. Do you know one of the most amazing findings was that the children didn't stay at their computer for long. They were more often gathered 3 or 4 around somebody else's computer, because the kids were all going, oh, look what I found here. And they'd all come along and actually sit down together and learn together. So, and this is very similar to Csikszentmihalyi's findings that children learn better when they're in groups. And I think adults are the same. We learn better when we collaborate, when we cooperate, when we're in competition, when we have that social connection. And so I think, Derek's right in one sense. That's a really important learning technology. And we do this a lot. What we're now calling, I suppose, Learning 2.0, the idea that we've got all these tools now that are available to us in this kind of culture of participation. And we openly create all this content and share it, and we end up with something called user-generated content. And the whole idea behind that is that it's ours. We own it. It's what the community's made, and it's what's important to the community. And that's why it's shared so fully and openly. Timo Papert, who some of you may have heard of, the man behind the Logo programming software. That's what he said, and I think he's right. The learner has to be center stage. The learner has to take charge. So how can we actually facilitate that with open practices? Well, I want to show you this to start with. This is from the work of a guy who's got a really unpronounceable name, Csikszentmihalyi. Some of you, who's actually heard of this guy? Not many of you, maybe 2 or 3, 5 of you. He says, look, if we're looking at anything where learning takes place, particularly things like, games playing or sport or any activity where you have to focus your mind, we've got 2 axes here. One is the skills, and the other one is the challenge. And if you have a kind of a flow channel which you need to be within, which is where you're concentrating the most. You imagine people like Usain Bolt, when he gets to the starting line, he larks around a bit and he has a chat with the people behind him, but then it comes to the point where he's totally focused, and you see him kind of narrow his vision, narrow his focus right down, and all he's thinking about is running to the finishing line and getting there first. He's in the flow at that point. And you notice this with your own learners, and you probably notice it yourself when you're studying something or focusing on something or watching something or learning. You suddenly get into the groove, don't you? It's that point where you're in that flow channel. And he says it's important for us to maintain this balance, this homeostasis, or this kind of equilibrium, if you like. We don't want to go too far in this direction where we're high in skills but low in challenge, because we get bored and we lose focus. And we don't want to go too high in a high challenge area where we've got no skills to cope with it, because then we get anxious. So what we do is we start off at this position, and often we move into that position where we become bored, or that position where we become anxious, and we then need to equalize it by getting back, by either gaining more skills or actually reducing the challenge in some way. And I think that's an important concept for us to think about in learning, because it explains a lot if you think about it, doesn't it? And I just want to show you another theory which is also important here, which is Vygotsky's kind of zone of proximal development, which I'm sure you're familiar with. But there's a new kind of twist to this now. There are three areas of learning. There's what you can do on your own, what you can do with the help of somebody who's a knowledgeable other person, and what you can't get to just yet. And I would put it to you that it's not just knowledgeable others, but it's now also technology that can support you to get to that point where you can expand and extend your knowledge and your capabilities and your competencies. So think about that as we're talking about moving towards more openness, and then think about how that actually applies in Csikszentmihalyi's flow theory diagram. Does it extend out? Does it push the boredom back, or does it help us to reduce our anxiety? And one of the things that we're doing, which is much more open now, and most of you, I think, are involved in this now, especially if you're using things like Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn, what you're doing is you're creating for yourself these learning networks, these personal learning networks. And very often they are open because you don't really have to pay to be involved in it. What you have to do is invest your time and your energy into it, and then you get payback for it. That's the kind of payment you need to make. So in that sense, it's open in the sense of gratis. But it's also open in the sense of libre. It's open in the sense of liberating you, because it allows you to connect with people that you would never, ever otherwise have had the chance to connect with. And that's a new form of openness that we're seeing happening in all sorts of learning contexts. And it's very powerful. And Howard Rheingold, who's an American academic, says that it's one of the most important literacies in the 21st century, that we understand how these networks work for us and how we apply them, how we harness the power of them, the potential of them. Let's just move on briefly to talk about free and open content. Now, I left school with nothing. I was bored at school. I was on the kind of the bottom end of Csikszentmihalyi's threshold there. I was totally bored. Things didn't make sense to me. I didn't feel like I belonged in school, and I left school with virtually no qualifications whatsoever. Went into a dead-end job. And it was only when I got married and started having kids, I thought, hey, Steve, you better wake up here and do something with your life, because you're going to have to start providing for people now. And so I went and retrained. Where did I go? I went to the British Open University, and I did my studies part-time, and I did a Bachelor of Science degree through the Open University in psychology. And at that point, the university took notice of me, and the rest is history, as they say. But the point is, that for me was the university of the second chance. And at the time, open learning of that type meant that you didn't have to have any qualifications to go into that process like you did with traditional university. So in a sense, it was a university of the second chance. And most of us who were students in that year, or that period, were in our 30s and 40s. So we were mature students, and it was a different type of learning for us. It was a learning where you were committed to it, but it was open in the sense that you had to have no qualifications necessarily to be involved in it. And that kind of open learning, is the ethos of that is in this as well. Now, things are moving towards this idea where we're now no longer worrying about what people's qualifications are when they start learning. It's also about making it open and available to them to do all sorts of stuff with, which you couldn't do any other way. So can you imagine the old copyright laws, which still stand, where you have a book and you want to take a part of it and use it somewhere else? Well, if you don't cite it properly, then you're accused of plagiarism. If you take a photocopy of a few pages and you don't pay the licensing fee, then you're accused of theft. But with the open content that's being made available out there now, what's happening is you are allowed to copy it You don't even have to ask permission. All you have to do is follow the rules. And the rules are that you cite the person where it came from, you attribute it to them, and you also relicense it under the same type of license that it's been licensed under, and that you can, if you like, repurpose it. And I'll give you some examples of how that happens in my own professional practice in a moment. But if you've noticed, on all my slides, the ones that I own, and the image is mine or the image is somebody else's who's put their license out under CC, Creative Commons is the licensing that's on the side of all my slides here. And I'm very careful to search for images that I know are copyright free. Because if you go onto the internet and you just take any image, just assuming it's copyright free, you may be wrong. Just assume that the default is that all images and all content on the internet is copyrighted unless it says otherwise. And then you'll avoid all the problems of being accused of theft or copyright breach. But this kind of idea of copyleft, this idea of the double C here is that openly, it's all about freedom to openly access, use, copy, modify, and share that content that you've seen in front of you. And this comes about because of what Dave Cormier calls the kind of open networks, the idea that everyone now is a node of production. You and I are all people who are capable of creating content. This is what the self-organized learning spaces are all about. It's about you and I actually creating the knowledge, actually coming together and negotiating the meaning behind that and then creating it and making it openly available so that other people can come and add more to it. And this idea is, I suppose there's a botanical metaphor here, the idea of rhizomatic plants which don't really have any center to them. You know, when you're in the garden and you see a weed, you pull it out, and then a few days later another one comes up somewhere else, and then another one, and so on. And you can never really get rid of it, not just because of the seeds are being propagated, but also some of these weeds have root structures that spread right underneath the ground, and you can never get rid of it completely. Well, this is what Cormier is talking about when he talks about rhizomatic learning, the idea that we all connect to each other, and the connections are so complicated and so complex and so widespread now that there's really no beginning or end to it. There's no center to it. So the idea of being involved in these networks of learning is a very powerful one. And you see, the whole point of this is that somewhere in the middle of there is you and me. And because we're all nodes of production now, each of us can share whatever we like with each other for free. If you want to charge for your work, that's fine, but you'll probably find less people will be interested in using it. Free seems really good somehow. Another theory for you before I move on to some examples. I'm going to mash up two theories here, really. You've probably recognized this Corrales' work based on Leyven Wenger's communities of practice, the idea that there's a core group and full members who are pulled into that core group, and then you've got peripheral participants, people who are kind of sat on the edge. And you've probably seen learners like this. They kind of lurk on the edge in an online space, or they lurk on the edge in a classroom, and they don't really want to participate. You don't know whether they want to be there or not, really. They kind of sit there and they watch a lot, but they don't really do much or say much or participate much. And then beyond that, you've got the transactional participants, and outside, passive observers. And all these people, you'll find them in your learning environments. But I'm going to come back to that in a moment, after I've talked to you about Jack Meraz's, the idea of transformational learning. Who's heard of that theory? The idea that there's a structural shift, almost like a seismic shift, when occasionally we transform ourselves through learning, and we never ever go back to the way we were before. So all of these things happen to us. It's about psychological change, it's about behavioral change, it's about, convictional changes. And it really is transformational, the idea that, in effect, to actually become a core group member of any experience, you have to go beyond what Kevin Bowden calls the transformational event horizon. It's like a black hole that sucks you in. And at that point, you're never the same again. That's the point we need to get to, I think, with any type of learning, really. And I live for that moment when I see my students, suddenly the light bulb comes on and they transform. and then they've got it, you know, and then they're never the same again. They never go back to that previous mode of thinking. And that kind of gets the hairs on the back of my neck going up when I see that happen. And that's why I'm so enthusiastic about being a teacher. So I mentioned self-organizing learning spaces earlier on. You see this in nature a lot. There seems to be no real leader in that pack or in that flock. They just all change direction all at once. Something must instigate a change in direction, but we don't really understand what it is. It's the same with all sorts of insect and other animal realm kind of behavior. Suddenly the whole thing changes direction. And the same thing seems to happen in a similar extent in these self-organized learning spaces. So Wikipedia, for instance, is a self-organized learning space. It's an open and free learning space. And you're seeing over 14 million articles now, with new ones being added every day, as people share their knowledge, as people come together, not necessarily experts, but most of them are, who are interested in these topics, and they create the content, then others come in, and gradually it builds up. And it gets polished, and it gets refined, and it gets to the point where it becomes a really useful and fairly accurate learning resource. The whole point about this is it's open to anyone, notice. And it's that openness that actually drives that process of creating that content. I'm going to stop in a moment. I'm just going to talk about a few more things. I want to talk about massive open online courses, which I'm sure you've heard of. But there are two types. Originally, well, there's more than two types, actually, but originally, if you look at the distinction between these two types, the original type of MOOC was what we now call the CMOOC, the idea of connectivist MOOCs, which were open and free, and the students basically drove those processes themselves. They decided what they wanted to learn, they decided what activities they were going to take part in, they decided also how they were going to be assessed in their learning and evaluated. Recently, we've seen the rise of Coursera and Udacity and all sorts of other commercially available platforms, and we're now calling these type of MOOCs the X-MOOCs because they are more commercial. They are much more organizational bound. And lots of organizations are actually taking these on now and actually providing open and free course material. But the business model behind this is that when you get to the point in your learning where you want accreditation for what you've done, then you have to pay for it. And there's the business model for you. So it's not as open and free as you think it is. It is to a point. So let's not get confused with MOOCs. But the whole idea behind MOOCs is that it's the community becoming the curriculum. The community decides what's important, and then the community creates that content. I was going to play a video for you, but I don't think we're going to have the time to do it. But there is a video which comes from Dave Cormier, who I cited earlier on, who I think you should see it. It's a kind of an animated video. And if you're interested in MOOCs, I think you should see it and watch it for 5 or 10 minutes, and it will explain to you the whole concept behind massive online open courses. I'll just give you a story or two here to finish with. Who's heard of Unity? One or two of you. If you're into the games business, you'll know what Unity is. Unity is probably the largest games engine company in the world. And a couple of years ago, they were selling their developer starter pack for about $1,500 US. And they had something like 100,000 developers around the world creating games using this package. And then they took a radical decision to give it away for free. You know, within a month, they had not just 100,000 people using the package, but over 1 million. And all these people were there beavering away, making these new games. And the deal is this. Unity said to all of their members who loaded this package down for free, they said, look, here's the deal. When you create a game, come to us with it, and we will evaluate it for you free of charge, and we will tell you what to do to raise the standard of it, if it needs to the point where it can be sold worldwide. And when you've done those changes, come back, we'll evaluate it again, and when it's ready, we will sell it for you through all of our worldwide outlets, and we'll take a percentage of the profits. Ka-ching. Yeah, you can see the business model. You can see how they monetize the idea of giving stuff away for free. So there is a way of giving it away for free and still making money out of it. I don't think that model will be useful for every type of business, but you can see how it worked in the gaming business. I'll give a head up here to Doug Belshaw, who's in the audience, I believe. He's going to be speaking later on. If you want to know more about this concept, then go and see Doug's session. Doug is actually working with Mozilla Foundation, and he talks about open badges, the idea that these badges are a new way of showing your accreditation in the digital age. They have metadata embedded into them. It's not just about, like a Cub Scout thing where I'm showing a badge. It's much more important than that. The idea behind it is that when you achieve something, you get awarded a badge. It could be, you could get awarded a badge for being at this conference today. I don't know if Don's thought of that yet. The conference I run in Plymouth every year, we awarded an open badge to everybody. And within that, there's some content embedded within it, but essentially you put it onto your website or onto your CV or e-portfolio or whatever you want. And it's becoming a new form of accreditation, if you like. So no longer are we just having to go and search in a cupboard, in a dusty old drawer for all of our certificates when we put in for a new job. All we can do is send, if you want now, send a digital file with all of your badges on it. So think about that as a new concept, and I'm sure he will elaborate on that for you. And the last thing I just want to show you is this. You notice that this is, if you know any of my slideshows, this is one of my slideshows which I shared on SlideShared under the Creative Commons license, and I shared it for repurposing. And it had already had something like about 50 or 60,000 hits by the time this went. And what's happened here is that somebody called Thomas Ramirez Zomarin has decided to translate it into Spanish. And there it is. And what I didn't know was that it's now opened up a huge readership, which I wouldn't have had before, in Latin America. So suddenly, all the Spanish-speaking parts of the world, they can read my slides in their own language. Here's another example. This is somebody who took one of my blog posts and translated it into French. I don't ask these people to do this. If I was to pay these people, it would cost me a lot of money, because it's a skill, isn't it? But they've translated this. I have to trust them that the translation is correct. You've got to have a bit of element of trust in this kind of openness. But the point is, I didn't ask for that to be done, and yet now there's loads of French people who are reading my blog who wouldn't have read it before. So suddenly your audience is increased, it's amplified through this openness, just for the fact that I actually gave this away for free under CC license. And one final example here. I don't know if you know this guy, this gentleman, sadly no longer with us, but that's Malcolm Mclaren, who was the the godfather of punk. He was the manager of the Sex Pistols and various other entrepreneurial things in the 1970s and 80s, and he became quite a notorious fella, a notorious character. And I saw him speak at Learning Without Frontiers in London here about 6 months before he died. He didn't know at the time, and neither did we, that he was terminally ill. And I took a picture of him. I was in the front row, and I took a picture of him. And I subsequently put it onto Flickr under a CC license, and then it ended up on his Wikipedia page, because someone saw it and wanted a picture of Malcolm Mclaren, and there it is, cropped down. And you can see underneath here that if you look at Wikimedia Commons, which is the free source behind all Wikipedia pages for images and video and so on, you can see it's been cropped by somebody else here. And you can see that where the source was, and you can see when the date was it was put up. And interestingly, when Malcolm Mclaren died, where did a lot of the press go for a free image of him? They went to Wikipedia. And so you see lots of newspapers of that time when they were reporting Malcolm Mclaren's death using that picture. And of course, underneath it, they had to put photo by Steve Wheeler. So my name is now inextricably linked forever with Malcolm McLaren. It's a bit of a kind of a payoff. All right, I could have made money by selling it, but I didn't want to do that. I gave it away for free, and as a result, amplified that content to a huge audience. Flipped learning I won't talk about because you probably all know about it, and all I will say is that instead of flipping the classroom, I tend to flip the roles. I tend to become the learner, and I ask my students to teach me. Now that's a bit radical, because people look at me a bit strange and say, but Steve, aren't you supposed to be you're paid to be a lecturer, shouldn't you be lecturing? No, I should be there helping them to learn, actually. And that for me is an open approach, because it means that I am bending the rules slightly, but what I'm asking them to do is to go away and learn and then come back and teach me, and then I challenge them and I ask them the what-if questions, which they have to kind of think about and reflect on and critically analyze and so on. So in effect, they have to learn more deeply than if I was just teaching them the content. So that for me is an open kind of approach to learning, which is much more powerful. And there's the reason why Paulo Freire talks about this, about let's take away this distinction between teachers and learners. Let's all become learners and teachers together. And then we'll see that things will change, things will be transformed. Twitter streams, so we use those in the classroom. We learn by teaching. The Latin phrase is descendo decimus, we learn by teaching. I learned some Latin at school. Finally, a quote for you to think about as I sit down and take some questions maybe. Thank you very much.
A very thought-provoking session. Thank you, Steve. Some questions. I'm sure there must be many out there. Mm-hmm.
Over there.
Oh, I beg your pardon. Please go.
Steve, thanks for that. Is there a paradigm to the knowledge that your last slide there, that knowledge, that people don't actually have to retain anything anymore, they just have to work out where to find it?
Do you know, the question, should we echo the question again? Just for
Please do, yes.
The idea is that the question was, you know, with the digital age, do we still have to remember things? Do we still have to know things? I was with Sugata Mitra, who I mentioned earlier on in Norway. He was doing a keynote there, and he said something to me during an interview, that knowledge isn't obsolete, but knowing is obsolete now. There's a difference, and he explained the difference. The knowledge actually, we still need knowledge, but do we need to know everything anymore? Do we need to cram our heads full of information? Do we need to cram our heads full of learning? Well, his argument is no, we don't, because as Gerd Leonhard said earlier on, we've got this device now which becomes an extension of our brain or our mind. And David Jonasson, who's another psychologist, he actually called it a mind tool. In effect, it's always been thus. And if you think about technology as tools, we've always had tools. And the tools have always been there to extend and enhance and amplify our capabilities, haven't they? So all we're doing now is the same we've always been doing. We're using tools to amplify our mind and to extend our memories and to give us the ability now to ask questions and then find the answers very quickly using the internet or Google or whatever. So in answer to your question in a roundabout way, I think we still need to know some things, but I think increasingly knowledge itself is becoming a little bit more flexible and open to interpretation. And of course, what is knowledge anyway? Knowledge is a negotiated territory. It's a contentious area where people will disagree. So isn't it more important that we get into the dialogue of what knowledge is rather than actually learning what that knowledge is? By getting into the dialogue of what knowledge really means, we'll learn anyway.
Oh, I thought that was a hand. It's a scratch. Well, if I may sort of continue that point, if you have the situation where you need to find out something, naturally now most people will just go to their iPhone or what have you and look it up. But I remember somebody saying to me, that's all very well, but what about real hard learning, which is what we do when we want to go further than just acquiring a fact. We want to get stuck into what that fact, the context of that fact, and therefore apply it to what we do. Does that chime with you?
Yeah, I find myself in some very strange cities in the world, as you do when you get to travel around. Just to give an example of how that works, I was in Oslo on Friday. I knew that my hotel was somewhere in the south, and I knew that the airport was to the north. You need to know those facts, firstly, to orientate yourself in a strange city. So there are certain things that you do need to know, but what I didn't need to know was how to get there, because I paid a taxi driver to get me there, right? I wished I hadn't, because it cost me 135 quid. It's the most expensive place in the world but the point is, whether I had to pay or not, there was somebody else to get me from point A to B. So really, did I need to know that the airport was to the north and my hotel was to the south? Maybe not. Maybe I did need to know in case there was no taxi available and I had to make another route there. So I think there are contingency plans you need to have. I think you need the belt and braces, and you need to know some knowledge, but I don't think you need to know all knowledge anymore. That's Harold in the front row there.
Yeah, Steve, interested in your perspective or your experiences on the disconnect between open content, a lot of people putting things out there,
Yeah.
but the domination of closed platforms. So I
Yeah.
principle for Facebook, I don't own it. Google owns my data.
Yeah.
YouTube is profiting from free content.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice for educators or others?
Well, I think the question, to amplify it again for the audience you're watching on video, is that if we're putting out content on Facebook or LinkedIn or any other social platforms, YouTube, then it tends to be that they own the content. If you read the small print and when you sign up to Facebook, it says, that actually the content is owned by them. Is that right? Is that our understanding? So the question is, what's the advice on that? Well, the advice is go for it anyway. They're tools, and I don't care who owns the tool, and I don't really care who owns my content, because I'm giving it away for free anyway. All I want is for my content to be out there being used by people so that people can learn from it. I've had it, and I'm done with publishing in closed academic journals for several reasons. Firstly, it takes far too long to publish it in paper or even online closed format because it goes through a very protracted process which could be shortened a lot of peer review. Secondly, you don't know how many people are reading it. And thirdly, you have to pay to read it. And I think it's iniquitous when we've used taxpayers' money to do research and then the publishers come along and charge you again to use your own research, which should be free because it's been paid for by the taxpayer. If there are any publishers in the room, I'd love to discuss this with you. But I've now decided to publish it only in open access journals, and I've now decided to, in fact, what I did was I resigned from all my editorial positions a couple of years ago because I thoroughly and fully believe that open learning is the way forward in all its forms. And that means that we have to use these tools. So we have to use YouTube if we want to put a video, or Vimeo, or some other similar tool. We have to use a blog tool like WordPress or Blogger or whatever if we want to put up text which is open for people to discuss and comment on. And for me, it doesn't matter because I'm going to give my content away for free. So whether they say they own the content or not doesn't matter because for me, the community owns it. And that's really my advice is if you've got stuff to give away, give it away and see what happens because you'll get paid back immeasurably by people having dialogue with you and sharing your content and learning from it. I've had several people come back to me and say, like, this has really changed my practice. That for me is reward enough. Over there. Oh, sorry, over there as well. The first year, okay.
What will happen to accreditation? Because I see your point about the Coursera type of things, that they're making the learning free enough, but they're going to charge for accreditation.
Yeah.
Surely if the learning is open and self-constructed, then why is there a need for accreditation?
A lot of MOOCs are very much instructor-led these days. So if you do a Coursera course from Harvard or wherever, it's going to be instructor-led. And the only difference is it's flexible in the sense that you can take a lot of the content when you want to. Increasingly, they're becoming synchronous delivery, I've noticed. So you have to be there. It's like an event. So it's becoming less flexible. So really, it's going back full circle to becoming almost like online. So the instructors often do assess your work for you. But the thing is, when there's 100,000 of you online, how are they going to assess that many pieces of work? So what happens is you get robot kind of assessment that takes place, where it becomes automated. And all right, there's an accuracy to it, but there's also hit and miss at times as well. So they've got a lot of stuff to iron out. But ultimately, the accreditation comes from the awarding body, who's usually the university behind or the organization behind that MOOC. And there are all sorts of different types of MOOCs available, as I said before, and different topics and subjects available on those MOOCs. You can take a short course or a long course. I'm not sure whether that you can do a whole degree yet through it, but I'm sure that will come if it's not already there. Yeah.
The point is that if we're going to see the death of formal learning, then why are we going to see the death of formal learning institutions? Like model, which is largely driven by that old way.
Yeah, I'm not sure we're going to see the death of formal learning. I think we're going to see the blurring of boundaries more between formal and informal learning. And I think we're going to see the blurring of boundaries between learning in a place and learning not in a place, learning on the move. There's going to be lots of blurring of the boundaries. The reason I don't think we're going to see the death of formal education, like, schools and colleges and universities, is because, there's so much that you can do there, but you can't do anywhere else. If you were learning from home, how would you do an experiment with a very expensive piece of equipment like a particle accelerator? You'd have to go to the university to do that. So there are certain things that universities supply and provide which you can't do any other way. I don't think we're going to see the death. I think we're going to see the slow decline of lots of universities, but I think there'll be some that will actually remain and always be there.
Was there one over there? Yes, there was, yeah.
And then
You're next.
I think that actually answers part of my question, but I have concern about how you sell collaborative or social learning when you're in a compliance-based environment.
Yeah.
So how do you sell the value of that when you've got to be a compliance team that can actually people understand?
I'm assuming that you're talking about organizational rules where you don't give content away or you don't give secrets away and that kind of thing. I think increasingly organizations, unless you're living on another planet somewhere, I think increasingly organizations are collaborating with each other anyway and forming alliances and forming conglomerates and so on. And I think the social learning that happens between those says what it says, that it becomes powerful because you're amplifying ideas, you're exchanging different cultural information and so on between maybe two different organizations. So I think we're going to see more of it, not less of it. And I think those organizations who do shut down their social learning platforms and who do enforce compliance that says that you don't share your content with anyone else, I think those are the ones that you'll find are going to be in trouble. A lot of them.
Gentleman there.
Hi Steve, Doug from Mozilla. Thanks for mentioning open badges. I'll be talking about those at 2 o'clock.
You got your commercial in.
So you mentioned openness, and I think it would be easy to come away from this excellent presentation and come away thinking that just making your stuff available online constitutes openness.
No.
And I know that you've got a lot more nuances in that. I just wanted to kind of encourage you to tease that out a bit.
Yeah, I mean, openness is actually a mindset. It's a part of, it's a set of decisions you have to make. Openness involves a lot of things. It's not just about, as you say, Doug, about giving your content away. I think in some ways it's about making yourself available to things like criticism. So if you aren't thick-skinned, you shouldn't be thinking about being open, because if you become open in the full sense of what I talk about when I talk about open scholarship, it means that you will open yourself up to all sorts of comments. Hopefully you will learn from those comments, because most of them will be constructive, but there will be some that will be destructive as well. And I'm assuming that's one of the things that you're trying to tease out, is it?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. But I think that today, as a learning professional, I don't think you can afford not to be open, in the sense that that you need to have dialogue with your peers and with your colleagues and with your community. Surely, that's one of the best ways of learning, is by being in connection with people through a personal learning network or through a blogging discussion or through an open forum online, where you're actually sharing best practice with the world of people who are also in the same field as you. And that, to me, has the biggest appeal to it in terms of openness.
One last question.
I'm interested in what you said about the sort of knowledge discussion becoming perhaps a bit more of a grey area to describe it on when a task becomes done correctly or not.
Yeah.
Just interested in what you sort of think around organisations that might
Yeah, I'll amplify the question again. The question is, if knowledge and skills are being negotiated now more, if there are lots of ways of doing things, how do we protect, I suppose, customers and clients and so on, if people do things wrong? And obviously there are certain areas. I used to work in nurse education. Right? I did 15 years in the National Health Service. Sounds like a prison sentence, doesn't it? But I worked for 15 years in the NHS, training nurses essentially, and there were certain things that we taught them to do which they had to do correctly. Do you know that nurses used to practice giving injections by injecting an orange? It's not done anymore because it's not realistic. I used to teach them cardiopulmonary resuscitation, which was a 15-to-2 ratio between 2 breaths and 15 chest compressions, right? That's not taught anymore either. You're now taught to give rhythmic compressions, but no mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Things change. At the time, you have to comply with what the current understanding and the current received knowledge is, but then things change and everyone has to teach something new. So knowledge is always being renegotiated all the time. But what we have to do is make sure that safety is important. So in medicine in particular, if you don't give the right drug dose, you kill someone. That's tragedy. We want to avoid that. Lots of compliance training is very similar to that. It doesn't necessarily result in the death of someone, but it might result in a lost revenue or a security breach or something. So a lot of compliance training is boring because of that very reason. And you have to sit, your learners in front of it, and they have to go through a particular process. I think we can actually improve that with the tools we've got available to us. How many of you have sat in front of a screen and been bored out of your head? You've gone down that kind of Csikszentmihalyi kind of axis, where you're totally bored because you know most of it anyway, and you just have to go through it and tick all the boxes. Well, we've got ways of changing that. We can actually improve that, I think, now with the new technologies that we've got.
On that note, we'll have to draw a close. So let's just once more thank Steve Wheeler.
Okay.